Good morning, children. In this chapter, we will study about poverty and how it is spread in this country and why we need to take care of it and what are the measures to eradicate it. So, let's begin the important chapter Poverty in India. In this chapter, we will cover these following topics. First, we are going to study about the identity and characteristic of the poverty, categorization of poverty, poverty line, causes of poverty, government approach to reduce poverty, and the poverty alleviation programs. So let's see one by one. What do you mean by poverty? Poverty is a situation in which an individual is unable to fulfill the basic needs of their life. These basic needs can be in the form of food, shelter, clothing, basic education, basic health, and etc. Poverty, if we talk what is the pattern of poverty in it, the pattern of development which is adopted in a successive 5-year plans that emphasize totally on the upliftment of the poorest of the poor through the program Antyodaya Yojana. By mean this program that we want to integrate the poor into the mainstream and achieving a minimum standard of living for all. We need to know where we stand today. For that, we need to know the phases of poverty in India. Poverty has many phases. It is multi-dimensional phases. Poverty is vulnerable. What is called vulnerability? Vulnerability to poverty is a measure which describe the greater probability of certain communities or individual of becoming or remaining poor in the coming years. This describes that how the number of poor people are remaining in the same situation and they are still struggling to come out from that scenario. If we see in detail, poverty is totally vulnerable and vulnerability describes the greater probability of being more adversely affected than the other people when bad time comes for everybody. Bad times means earthquake, flood, or any natural calamities. So we need to take care of the poverty as in India it is vulnerable. The section of the society that are vulnerable to poverty in urban area are like those people who are engaged in the activity like they are cobblers, flower sellers, cart vendors, beggars, or street vendors. These people are mostly vulnerable in urban area. And in the rural area, the people who are engaged in the activity like marginal and small farmers, village artisans, landless laborers, these all are generally vulnerable in rural area. Poverty, in that case, we can see it is a call for action. It is a call to change the world. It is a call for action for the poor and the wealthy people should be alike. It is call to change the world. Many more may have enough to eat. Many more may have enough to have the shelter, access to education, wealth, health, protection, from violence and voice in what happens in their communities that should come out. So these can be action, these can be an action for plans, these can be an action to change the world in the field of poverty. Poverty has many dimensions. Poverty not only involves lackness of the basic necessities of life, but it also means the denial of opportunities to live a tolerable life, to lead a long and healthy life and creative life, to plan for joy and decent standard of living, to have the freedom and dignity and self-respect. So we can say poverty, by means of poverty we cannot say only that having a lackness of the food and necessity things, but also the equal opportunities, freedom, proper health, proper healthy and standard life, and dignityful life also required. So in that case we have a multiple indicators of poverty. If the person income is low level and their consumption is also low level, that indicate that the people are belonging to poor situation. So these are the indicators. Just look at these points. level of income and consumption. That also shows what is the condition of a person income and person's total consumption capacity, that indicate that the person is in poor condition or not. Their social indicators, meaning by this is socially how their image are and socially how much equality they are getting. Indicators of vulnerability to risk means how much they are able to come out from the situation. Are they able or are they still struggling to be in a that condition? So that will show the total poverty scenario and their social and political access too. If these people are able to get all the social benefit and the political benefit which is given by the government, means the person is out of poverty scenario. If not, they are in poor scenario. So this is the indicators of poverty. So let's see what is the meaning of poverty. We have already seen it's a situation, it is a phenomena which shows the inability to fulfill the basic requirements or need of the life like food, shelter, clothing, health, education, etc. If a person is not able to earn sufficient money to fulfill their basic need, means there will be poverty. So generally we have a characteristic of poverty and the poor people. If we are going to identify the categorization, or we can say identify the characteristic of a poor people, will find that mostly they live in huts, they have no their own shelter. In village area they are either landless or some of them have small piece of land. They do not get sufficient food. They are generally in a starvation situation. They have a malnutrition. They are uneducated and unskilled. So these all are the sign, these all are the characteristic of a group that they are belonging to poor category. Many of them, some suffer from the diseases, health condition is poor, they do not get safe and drinking water and sanitation facility, they do not get education, they need to borrow money, and mostly they are in debt trap. There is gender inequality, women are the poorest among these poor people. So these are the characteristic of poverty and the poor people. Now, what are the measures of poverty? We have a two type of poverty. One is absolute, which means inability to secure basic necessity of life like food, shelter, clothing, basic education, health, and other things. And one other is relative, which means poverty of people in comparison to another person or place or a country. If we are going to compare one person or one place and in comparison to other people, that will be known as relative poverty. Can be poor in comparison to big businessman. A casual worker can be poor in comparison to a regular salaried worker like teacher. So these are the examples, you can use it. Like one more example we can have, India is poor in comparison to USA. So whenever a country, or person or any company or any place is comparing in comparison to other is getting poor, so that will be known as relative poverty. So if we have a definitions and the differences between these two terms, that the absolute poverty is that condition where a person is not able to earn minimum amount of income to fulfill their basic needs. But the relative poverty is that type of poverty that in one person or group of person with relation to other person or group of person are not able to fulfill their average standard of living in the society. Absolute poverty is decided by the income of the person himself, but relative poverty is decided by the income level of other persons. Absolute poverty is measured through the poverty line, but the relative poverty may or may not related to poverty line. More common developing and underdeveloped countries face absolute poverty, but the relative poverty is commonly faced by developing and developed countries. Now we are going to see the another term, poverty line. What do we mean by poverty line? Poverty line is a cutoff point which divide the population into two parts, poor and non-poor. So if we see here, you can write down it's a cut-off point on the line of distribution which usually divide the population of the country as poor and non-poor. That line is denoted as poverty line. For this, the minimum income required for a person to satisfy his basic need of life, that will be termed as poverty line. So this is generally used to identify poor people. Now we are going to see first how many type of poor people we have and how they have been categorized. The poverty has been categorized into three parts. So first of all, we are going to see the first part, that is chronic poor. Chronic poor, which include who are always poor and those who are usually poor. There are two type of poverty is in this category. One is always poor and second is usually poor. Who are always poor, they will be known as, who remain always, that they are unable to fulfill their basic need, they will be always poor. And those who are usually poor means sometime they are having little more money, so that time they are above poverty line, so that time they will not be in poor condition, but most of the time they are below poverty line, so they will be known as poor. So that type of people are known as casually, or we can say usually poor. So chronic poor, we can say always poor, and the usually poor, there is a combination. Second category is transient poor. In this, two type of poor comes. One is churning and second is occasionally. Churning poor, who are regularly move in and out of poverty line, like small farmers, seasonal. These people are getting, in some season they have a good amount of income and other season they do not have. So in some season they are beyond poverty line, but in other season they are below poverty line. Occasionally poor, who are mostly used to be rich, but sometime due to some bad luck, due to some other any tragedy, they are in poor condition. So adding these all two kind, we will get transient poor. And the third category, that is non-poor, who is always above poverty line, they are not below poverty line. So we can see it with the diagram, that what is called poverty line. You can see in that we have categorized three. One is chronic, second transient, and third is non-poor. In chronic there is two, always and usually. See the diagram, that in always poor, that is always below poverty line, and usually poor, that most of the time they are below poverty line, but sometime they get good amount of income, that time they are above poverty line. In transient, you will find churning and occasionally. In churning poor, what happens, the people are always moves in or out of the poverty line, but in occasionally, most of the time they are above poverty line. Due to some bad luck or some patchwork of the bad luck, they are in below poverty line. And the non-poor categories people are never used to be around poverty line. Now how do we calculate this poverty line? What are the basis of calculation? So there are some methods. We are going to understand this method. The minimum food required for a person is calculated in calories, and then it is converted into equivalent money value. A minimum amount is added for shelter and clothing. The total amount is called poverty line. If a person income or expenditure is less than poverty line, then he or she will be considered as poor, means below poverty line. In India, usually monthly per capita expenditure we use to identify BPL family. So here we have the person who has actually started measuring poverty. His name is Dadabhai Naroji. In pre-independent India, he was the first person who estimated poverty line in India using method jail cost of living. He estimated the amount of money needed for providing food to a prisoner, and he used to the menu which is provided to the prisoner, that menu he has used an appropriate prevailing price at what it has been available to that prisoner, that was used to calculate the jail cost of living of poverty line. There was some adjustment made to calculate the amount needed for children too. This was the procedure. Through this, he has done the calculation of jail cost of living. For this adjustment, he assumed that one third of the population consists of children and half of them are consuming very little or nil. The other half is consuming half of the adult diet. If we are going to see in detail, you will find here it has been discussed that the total population is divided into two parts. First part is one third and second part is two-third. Two-third part is related to adult and they consume full diet. But the first part which we have seen, one third, that is divided into two parts. One third who consumes half of the adult and other one third who consumes very little. The weighted average of the consumption of these three segments, when we are going to calculate, we find 3 by 4 of the total adult gel cost of living is being used. We can further see with the calculation that one third are using of the adult, half of the adult diet, and other one third are using zero or nil diet. So we can get the value and will find with the calculation that the 3/4 total calculation is coming of the overall population living in the jail, means approx 75% they need to have the food and other basic requirement. If they are able to fulfill it, then they will be considered beyond poverty line. Otherwise, these people will be considered at below poverty line. Apart from that, after independence, we had a many more other methods. In 1962, Planning Commission set up a study group, and in 1979, another task force on projection of minimum needs and effective consumption demand was formed, and in 89 and 2005 expert groups were made, and accordingly we had another method for the determination of poverty line. First is minimum calorie intake. As per this method in India, the Planning Commission has adopted the definition provided by the Task Force on Projection of Minimum Need and Effective Consumption Demand, that a person who is belonging to below poverty line, if his daily consumption of calorie is less than 2400 calorie in rural area and 2100 calorie in urban area, means those people will be considered that they are belonging to below poverty line. If they are above, then there will be above poverty line. And second method was monthly per capita expenditure method, or MPCE method. For this, in rural area, their consumption should be at worth of rupee 816 per person in a month, and for urban area it should be 1000 per person in a month. If these conditions are fulfilled, means the people or a group of society will be considered among above the poverty line, and otherwise they will be below poverty line. But their measuring of these techniques have some drawbacks, some limitation. How? Because they does not differentiate between poor and very poor. They are keeping all the poor people below poverty line and all the people who are above poverty line. Means only two categories they are dividing. Out of those poor, how many are very poor, how many are actually and absolutely poor, we are unable to get it. It consider only the money needed for food, shelter and clothing. But apart from that, we have seen there are other dimensions too, other phases too of poverty, that we required basic education, healthcare, sanitation, drinking facility. There are many more. So we cannot say that only food, shelter and clothing will be true sign. But the poverty line only consider these three things. It does not consider social factors too, like illiteracy, social discrimination, ill health and other things. It also is manipulated by several other authorities. Apart from that, we have some alternative method too. One method which was propounded by Mr. Amartya Sen, he has developed an index which is known as Sen Index. Poverty Gap Index, squared poverty gaps are also is being used nowadays to identify poor. Now we are going to see one important term related to it, that is head count ratio, which find out how many people are living below poverty line. It estimates the number of person whose overall per capita consumption expenditure is below the poverty line and measuring them as the proportion of population. It can be calculated total population upon number of people below poverty line into 100. So this was the poverty line. Now we are going to see what is poverty situation in India. Right now, if you can see diagram properly, so this can be divided into some portion like number of people in the year 1973 to 1974. There were 320 people who were below poverty line, but in 2011 and 12, this number has been decreased to 270 million people. If we see the proportion in 1973 to 74, around 55% of the population was below poverty line, but in 2011 and 12 report, it has decreased to 22%. More than 75% poor people were living in rural areas. Poverty was very severe in some states like Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh. And poverty was reduced. It was successfully decreased into other states, Tamil Nadu and West Bengal. What are the causes of poverty? Why poverty exists? What will be the major responsible factor? So these factors are population explosion. When there will be lot of people, accordingly if we are unable to increase our resources, there will be poverty. British rule, as British have dominated us for more than 200 years and they have taken all the resources, all the valuable things which is we required to develop our nation, that also somehow pulled back to us in a poverty situation. Underdeveloped agriculture sector, as we have seen, that's more than 75% people are working in the primary sector, and that sector is too, that is not developed, and there is disguised unemployment. So we need to do development in this sector. Due to underdevelopment, there is poverty. There is widespread of unemployment in India. We know that number of graduates are every year getting pass out even after they are not able to get the job. So we have a number of unemployment people, and that somehow create poverty situation. Indebtedness, that is another of important factor, or we can say important reason, that due to having debt trap and being in that situation, they require more and more money, and that keeps them to be in a poor situation. Due to unequal distribution of wealth, all the money and the assets are not equally distributed. There is a big gap between rich and poor. Low level of capital formation. We are unable to do the investment. There is underdeveloped infrastructure. The general price level of the country in each product, it is rising, and other two reasons, political factors and social factors, are also responsible. Political factors means every government approaches and their policies. Apart from that, social factors means all those social evils which is existed in the economy, that also is the one of measures, one of the factor responsible for poverty. Now what will be the effect of poverty? We all are very much acquainted with this, that due to poverty we will have illiteracy, we can have the child labor, nutritional and diet we will not be having proper, there will be poor living condition and unemployment, there will be lack of hygiene and sanitation, we will have to feminize the poverty. Right now we can see the poverty has been feminized. There are number of women who are in a poor condition, and will be many more other tensions too. So, what are the approaches of the government to abolish the poverty? Poverty can be abolished by these three methods, that these three approaches has been adopted by government. We'll see about it in next video.